Well, hello again, friends. We are entering a different environment
We
today.
are.
We're at Bob's house.
How about that?
Yep.
Yeah.
So, because I don't live in my house anymore. This is Bob and I's first discussion since our event at the Arcata Theater last week.
It's true.
Which was a lot of fun. But Bob and I are getting back into our discussion about the principles of social change. So I'm going to let Bob do a quick recap of all the things that we've talked about so far.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're actually entering the final phase of this overview of social change. And we're looking at it from the perspective of the writings of the Baha'i faith. So it's important to know that this is not stuff Matt and I are making up as we go.
Yeah.
We're actually relying on an authority, and that's the authority of the Word of God, and it's also the authority of the institutions of that faith. So, and I found them very useful in my own life and my own development. And they talk very explicitly about processes of social change. In fact, that really is the purpose of every revelation, is transformation, and individual transformation and the transformation of society. So I think that's just something which may have been lost in the process of our educations in the modern world, but it actually is a fact. So having said all that, then the question becomes, okay, well, where are we in understanding that process? And here's the way I understand sort of where we are, is we live our lives according to what the Baha'i faith calls a twofold moral purpose. And the first fold of that purpose is our own individual intellectual and spiritual development. And that's crucially important for us to take the qualities that we have been born with, whether it be love or knowledge or patience or forgiveness, all of those things, and cultivate them to their fullest potential. That is what individual development looks like. And then the second fold of that purpose, which can't really be separated from the first, they sort of go on side by side, is that at whatever place we are in our own individual development, we're doing what we can to work positively for the transformation of society. Okay? And in our day and age, we're working toward a transformation from the conflict and division, which is rampant in our time, toward the unity of all humanity, which is the prerequisite for, I think, both material and spiritual progress in the world.
Well, because transformation, whether people in our culture and beyond want to admit it or not, is taking place. Right?
There's no question about it.
Right. We are living through transformation. And
Right.
and just the way I'm seeing things, that's elevating people's awareness, but yet at the same time angst. Right?
Oh, there's no question about all that. I think that all of that is 100% true.
Mm-hmm.
I think the ultimate question, and this is a question that certainly members of the Baha'i community talk about among themselves and with others, is sort of like, well, where do we begin this process of social transformation, knowing what we know about these principles on a concrete basis? And I think that's really the subject of this last episode in this overview. The idea is that there's no way to begin moving forward toward progress in society unless and until we actually know where we are. You know, like, what is a present reality? And I know so many people who spend so much time today, because we're living in this transitional period, wondering how to understand where we are.
What's happening
in history, like what is going on, like how to explain all of this. And I know this might sound strange or unusual if you've never been exposed to the writings of the Baha'i faith, but the writings of the faith itself, meaning the revelation from God, talk specifically about where humanity is.
Well, I'm just thinking of the word, you just used the word revelation, and since a lot of, again, we've talked about this a lot, our audience members come from a Christian worldview, but these spiritual teachings are universal principles that Jesus would reflect, and it's not exclusive. The message isn't exclusive.
Yeah, well, the way I understand it, based on my knowledge of not just Baha'i writings, but of all spiritual writings that I know about, is that a figure like Jesus is part of this process. I mean, of transformation. He's part of that process, but he is not exclusive to the process, meaning that that process of human advancement was ongoing since the beginning of humanity. And so there were also, shall we say, messengers of God that existed prior to Jesus. I think people accept that. Well, it's natural to know that whatever stage humanity is in at the time of Jesus' life is going to benefit hugely from the presence of Jesus. And I think certainly generations afterwards, including people today, also benefit from his teachings.
Well, it's those spiritual principles that are bringing people together again.
It's absolutely foundational.
Yeah.
I think what Jesus brought is absolutely foundational for the progress of humanity at every level. It's similar to what I think is like first grade for me was essential in my progress as a human being.
Yeah.
It was there I learned sort of like what a number was, and I learned what a letter is and how to begin putting those things together, and that's fundamental for all of my learning. So when I look at someone like a Moses, I'm thinking that that's how fundamental he is for the progress of humanity. It's that same way, but it doesn't mean that God stops in helping humanity along at that level.
Yeah. And the book that Christians are talking about these days more and more is the book of Revelation, because this is the transformation.
Right.
Things are being revealed to humanity.
Right.
In all these different arenas of our lives.
Right.
And people are having a very hard time adjusting to that, because maybe the way I see it is we believed in things for a long time that may not necessarily be 100% accurate, or may have been manipulated at times in history. We've talked before about if we're going to have fundamental transformational change, consensus on how we got here, which is part 4 today, right? Right? Or what is the current reality?
Yeah,
right?
I think the big question it's less how we got here, although that's helpful. I think what's more important for change to happen, and I think of this on a personal level and on the level of society as well, it's more important to know where we are.
Yeah. Okay.
Because until you know where we are, we don't know where to go.
Okay, how would you say where we are?
Well, I would say this is the principle that, as I understand it, is a principle of evolution. So take my life or your life or anybody's life, is that over the course of our lifespan there is an evolution. There is both on a physical level and on, shall we say, a mental level, emotional level, a spirit, all these different parts of ourselves. We're constantly evolving as a person over time, and I think that's the starting point. But if we just understand that as collectively, is one way of understanding the history of humanity is to understand it as an evolution, similar to the evolution of a lifespan of an individual human being. So the idea is that at some point in human organization, collective organization, human organization was in its infancy. And another point is it grows. Human organization collectively might mature out of its infancy and become a toddler.
We're growing as a species.
Right, and then become a child, and then become a preteen, and then become a teenager, and then become an adult. And so if we understand, shall we say, the history of humanity in those terms, I think that it's helpful to make sense of where we are. Because what the Baha'i writings say, and they explicitly say, believe me, I don't have enough knowledge to understand these on my own without this guidance, is what it says is that mankind today is, quote, on the threshold of its maturity, unquote. And the way that I think Baha'is around the world understand this is that basically we're living in the age of adolescence.
Right. Right.
And that's such an interesting statement that's so loaded with like, different images come to our mind. But the better I've come to understand this through meditation and reflection and the reading of the writings and just working with people, is the more convinced I am is that this is true.
Do you mean you don't escape and go home and watch television?
Well, there are times I do like watching baseball.
I know.
But
your times of reflection,
Yeah.
because the principles you're talking about are major, big
This is a big thing.
It's the biggest.
This is not just where humanity is in the United States, and I think definitely the period of adolescence really describes what we see day to day going on in the U.S. in fundamental ways. But it describes what's going on all over the world.
Maybe like get away, just because I like trying to make it applicable for how to make that concept concrete. It's like it's like, oh man, I just had it and I lost it, Bob. But that happens sometimes.
It does.
But
it does.
Our adolescence, what can I gain out of this? Maybe that's what I was thinking. Like our culture is looking at every scenario they may be placed in, and it's a lot of maybe the materialism of how can I benefit from this. And so,
well, I can only see how I'm benefiting from that realization, because that's sort of where we are.
Yeah.
Is I think I benefit from that because it helps me to understand myself, because I've lived in this society. I've been conditioned, socially by the society. So it helps me to step back from a lot of the things that I've been taught by the society, whether it's in the school system or not, and come back and say, how can I understand that? How do I understand where I am in my own progress? But I think even more than that, it helps me understand where we are, so that when I'm dealing with other people who've been through this social conditioning but may not, shall we say, have received the gift of this knowledge that I have, at least not yet, is it helps me meet people where they are. Like, I can't be in relationship with other people and therefore contribute to society in a positive way unless I can be in relationship with someone, and you can't be in relationship with someone if you're on two different levels.
And you mentioned just recently the ability to have conversation in where are we at right now, which is, again, today's focus for here and now. The ability to have a conversation about ideas is a higher level conversation that you say, I've heard you say, that people struggle to engage within.
Yeah, I mean, I know I talk to people all the time, and fortunately I'm able to have meaningful conversations like I have with Matt. But I would say that I don't know how you feel, but most of the conversation that I hear day to day, you might call it chit chat or small talk or commercial speak or whatever you want to call it, there's very little about what you actually think or how you feel that actually is being revealed in the course of that conversation. There's very little of that going on in our society. So the ability to connect with the person is the beginning of actually having influence in society.
Yeah, well, people have lost, in a major way, the abilities of their own power and influence, and they're relying on institutions to provide them the direction. And we're talking about the growth of the individual in one of our earlier ones, the actualization of your own power and how to cultivate it is the word you used again today.
Right.
That we should be ongoingly cultivating our own power to act and to speak on behalf of spiritual principles and into better humanity.
But to me, it just makes sense. But most of society is not there yet because we're stuck in our teenage years. So, like I understand. I think I love teenagers. I taught high school for over 20 years. I'm very attracted to the teenage years. And I think what attracts me to teenagers is there is there is an openness and an energy about being a teenager. And I think that although it's exhausting to live in this society today, just like it's exhausting to be around teenagers all day, it's also energizing. I mean, there's an energy in society, let's say, that exists today that didn't exist when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
It's just amazing how much energy there is in society now. A lot of it is really sort of misspent or misguided energy, because that's what teenagers do. There's a lot of confusion because teenagers are confused.
Yep.
You know what I'm saying? But there's also glimpses of these just incredible acts of, shall we say, of compassion. I mean, teenagers have this incredible. Their hearts are still open in ways that, in some ways, adults are not.
Yeah, well, they have seemed. My experience has been many of them seem to have an innate ability to read the adults that they are surrounded by, and to discern who is being honest with them and who is not.
Right. So understand, when I say we're living in a teenage world, that's the present reality. It's not meant to be criticism. It's just meant to help us understand a lot of things which don't make sense, like a teenager is a bundle of contradictions.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what a teenager is. They're trying to figure themselves out. They don't really know who they are. Well, isn't that our society right there? You know?
Well, there's plenty of people rushing into this vacuum to provide the answers, though, aren't there?
Well, of course, because there's a market for it. And that's how it works.
Yeah.
Because we live in a teenage society. So I think on one end is the kind of energy that I experience in the world today is that kind of a frenetic, anxious, overwhelmed, like teenage energy, which is both, I think, can be very positive, but also very exhausting.
It's the foundation for transformational change, though.
There's no question about it.
Because if people are personally motivated to pursue the truth, in whatever vein they want, they should, by the journey itself, become more aware.
Right.
Even if they don't come to all the conclusions that they would even expect of beginning to engage in the journey.
Right.
So, because the journey is never ending, which I think we tried to speak at the theater the other night about, this is never a destination. These conversations don't ever end.
No.
They're
the evolution is a process-oriented, shall we say, paradigm, not a result-oriented paradigm.
But it can always only continue to progress as long as the individuals participating in it are open enough to discuss the world of ideas.
Right, and I think that's one of the value of living through the teenage years, and for humanity have gotten to the teenage years means it's gotten to survive through its infancy, it's survived through its toddlerhood, it's survived its childhood. You know, so in one way, that's a real progression, and that's important. I will say this is that I think the principal way in our society that I see, shall we say, a teenage consciousness that's sort of like the cultural norm is in the idea that in our society today what we value most is freedom. I mean, that is the principal value in our society. That's all everybody wants is freedom, and I see that as that's a teenage thing. I mean, you know, by the time you're a teenager, you're still living under your parents' roof. There's still a lot of rules, but you feel like you're mature enough to be on your own. And so what you want is freedom from a lot of those rules. And this becomes people's priorities. But if you asked a teenager, well, what if you had all the freedom you wanted? You got every freedom you wanted. What would you do with it? They would go blank. They'd have no idea where to go. I had some conversations with friends of mine who make freedom sort of like the personal freedoms, the gaining of personal freedoms, they're the goal of their life. That's how they want to transform society. And I remember asking one of these friends, just out of the blue, saying, let's say you had all these freedoms, what would you do? And I want you to know he's in his 60s.
Yeah.
He twiddled his thumb just like a teenager would and said, I honestly don't know. And I said, well, that's how most teenagers would be. If they had all the freedom to do, they'd probably stay up in their room and play video games or smoke dope or whatever. They would do nothing constructive because that's a teenage thing. We want freedom for the sake of freedom. But freedom is not, for an adult, freedom is not an end in itself. To an adult, freedom is a means to something.
Yep.
But we don't think of it that way. We think of freedom as the end. That's why I think that we live in such a materialistic society. We live in such a materialistic society where money becomes the goal, because most people are inculcated in the belief that if they just were rich, they could do whatever they want.
Yep. Or they see what I thought of earlier, it flashed back based on what you said, the parallel to the world that we see, especially in the United States, is that the teenagers are always trying to get away with something.
Right.
And tell me you don't see the adults of this world right now in their adolescent years trying to get away with something.
You got it.
There are people
Right.
out
This
there
is
in
our
our
culture.
lives, the culture is trying to get away with something.
Right.
So I really like that parallel to the adolescence. We are culturally, humanity is in an adolescent phase.
Right.
Materialistic and trying to shirk the system, even the ones that run the system.
Right.
Everybody's becoming growingly aware of that, and this is unsustainable in the maturity of the species.
No, but I think it's just a stage in human evolution. And I think if we understand that that's what we're dealing with today, that gives us a starting point to ask ourselves, as individuals and as members of communities, is what would be the next step in doing this. Now, I find the Baha'i conception of adolescence to be fascinating, because they don't say humanity is in its adolescence. That's my interpretation. What they say is humanity is on, quote, the threshold of maturity.
Much more
unquote.
positive, yes.
It's like, so the idea is that we are moving in the direction of maturity. We're just not, collectively as a culture, all the way there yet. You know what I'm saying? And I think that that's important to keep in mind, is that within every adolescence is the potential for a maturity.
Because it requires this, into this current state of affairs, is there isn't consensus right now on any of the narratives. In fact, it's splintered and fragmented into many different
Well, of course, because
realities.
teenagers want what they want, and if everybody wants what they want, you live in a society that's full of conflict and division.
Yes, and why would you, if you're
It's
allowed,
chaos.
if you as the individual are allowed to define the truth, then what do you have to even look for anymore?
Right.
So there is no journey. Your journey's over once you've decided that you know it all.
Right. Exactly.
And do we have a culture right now that reflects, like you said, your friend that believes in freedom? There are young people and older that take that element to the extreme.
Right.
Even at the expense of how their freedom will impact other people.
Oh, there's no question about it. Right. And I think that's absolutely the case. But I do want to say is that for me, I might have an experience with a friend here, an acquaintance here, but I feel like it's a window into how a whole culture thinks. And I know you've worked with thousands probably of students, and certainly I have. And this is also my experience of working with most young people in today's society, is that what they value the most is freedom. Is just how it is. How they express that might be different, but that is a cultural thing that they've inherited. But I don't think it's confined to the teenagers of the world. I think this is all of humanity. This is most of the baby boomers. I'm a baby boomer, and I make no apologies for my peer group. But I think the reason why our peer group has been as destructive in the world as it has been is because we're basically teenagers running the world. and teenagers are going to be destructive. And that's the baby boomers.
Self-absorbed, maybe?
Well, that's a teenage thing. A teenage. I want my freedom. I don't want my freedom to do good for other people. I want my freedom so I could do what I want. And this is a normal phase that someone who's forming an identity, I think, goes through. On a collective level, the Baha'i writings say this is where we are. And that has to be informed, shall we say, how I live my life. Because I want to live within reality.
Yeah, and the influence, as we translate this back to an educational level, because where we are at in society right now, with that particular institution that we've spent a lot of our time on, it's a position where the system isn't open to this discussion.
Oh, no, not at all.
So if it's not open to it doesn't want what I saw the system wanted even 20 years ago when I was in high school. The system seemed to want influencers, people that were influential adults on young people, mentors, if you will, right? Right now, the system seems to want to be the influencer, and any individual teachers that operate or educators that operate within the confines of that domain. If you're an individual influencer, you are a threat, or you are perceived as if you're going to teach young people how to engage in this type of a conversation, which is necessary for the progress of humanity, but they are not getting that in our current paradigm, which is what brought a lot of folks out to the event, is to have these kinds of conversations. The institution actually likes to call them courageous conversations, but they just never actually engage with those courageous conversations.
No, I don't. And if I had to say, how do I understand the reason why, is that systemically those people who are in control of, shall we say, the established order, for lack of a better word, is these are the people who are on top. They have the wealth and the status. They're in control of the political, economic, and social systems in our society. So they don't want change.
Yeah.
I mean, change is threatening for them, and adolescence is a time of change. And so for them to make sure that adolescents never grow into adults, is we have to make sure that these kinds of conversations that could actually help individuals and society to advance can't happen. And I think this is one reason why more and more in the educational system, we've seen individual teachers have less and less authority in terms of what they teach and how they teach, and more is determined by central authorities of power. And I think it's to make sure that those adolescents don't grow into adults.
Yeah, no, I know we'll find a lot of people that will probably disagree with us on that construct.
That's fine.
But that's fine. That
doesn't make it any less true.
Right, but there's a growing, again, the great awakening of a lot of the parents out there in Americans in general and the global community that is witnessing the institutional implementation of policies and or ideas that are actually counter-spiritual.
Yes.
Some policies being implemented are counter-spiritual.
Oh, very much so.
So, and there's a growing awareness of that, which is motivating more people to take part in this age of transformation. But we're all adolescents from the position of, so now what do I do with this awareness? Because maybe people have the frustration of seeing reality, but not knowing where to go.
Right. How do you mature then as an individual in a society that is trying to stop you from growing to maturity? Right. It's like, how does that happen? And like you, I do think that the beginning of this, and we've talked about this, I mean, we've talked about it privately, but we've also talked about it on camera, is really the beginning of this is understanding our identities as an individual. I'm clear that we're living today like people in adolescence would, within what I would call a crisis of identity. And that could be a subject for a whole other series of interviews. But to make it short and sweet, I think people, the real crisis of identity stems from shall we say, from the inability of most people to have confidence in their own capacity to discern what is true from what is false. And I think that another shorthand way of saying that is that people are confused. And people don't have confidence that faced with information, they actually could get through it and actually independently know what is true.
Yeah, we cannot have unity when there's confusion about the current reality. There's so many different...
Confusion stops everything. And so I think that's the state. It's not the kind of thing that most people talk about openly, because who wants to admit they don't know? But there are moments that I see this in conversations, and I can offer to you, Matt, and to whoever happens to watch this, is that it's certainly something I've had to work through myself. Is how do I know something is true? These are things which are not openly, shall I say, not openly cultivated in our school systems today. And I honestly believe that within the kind of systems we live in, which is a system of compliance with authority, we never develop those. We're never supposed to develop those qualities. But here's the problem. The problem is once we're in that constant state of confusion or doubt, is that stops us in our tracks. It's like society is only going to change, and I'm only going to grow as an individual to the extent I can take action. And it's my actions to progress that give me the kind of life experience I need to continue progressing. But the bottom line is why would I take an action, any action, if I'm living in a state of confusion or doubt? If I'm living in a state of confusion or doubt, I will do nothing.
But wait, if you have an answer, then that means you're arrogant. That's what we talk about.
This is the way society is organized, to try to stop us from engaging in this process. But the bottom line is what is true is what is true. And we are inborn with the capacity to discern what is true from what is false. It's just a quality which has been, shall we say, suppressed in our society. But really, it's been so suppressed to the point that people don't even know the truth of who they are.
That is
and I think this
apparent.
Is the fundamental truth, is my identity. And this is why I call this, shall we say, this pervasive confusion and doubt as a crisis of identity. Because if I don't know who I am, then I don't know which way to turn. And I don't know what is a step forward for me. So I just don't step. And I don't take any action. And shall we say, I'm just stuck in place. It's like living in quicksand. And I think it's the kind of place where despair sets in, where depression sets in. A lot of the mental health issues we have, I think, are an outgrowth of, shall we say, this spiritual emptiness that I refer to as a crisis of identity.
And what do we want for people to be dependent, interdependent, or independent? From what level of those three kind of organizing principles of a civilization? We're at a very interdependent and growingly dependent culture, society. But the people with the capacities to help more human beings are going to be those independent people that are going to give them the self-empowering capabilities to not just engage in the transformational change, but I don't hesitate to say lead it, but they just will be active participants within there. You need to have the confidence in your own abilities to recognize and cultivate the gifts that the Creator has blessed us with, whatever those capacities may be. And to be aware of those capacities in yourself and work to develop those capacities. I think the reason I asked you about TV earlier is because in the current state of our paradigm, the culture that we live in, it is an entertainment culture that is, again, financed by big money, and to keep us in adolescence and to keep us separated by, again, whatever identity, political world you want to attach it with, or faith-based or racial or whatever it is, class structure, whatever it is. And all those things do, to me it seems, is serve to keep us from unity.
They're serving to keep us from maturing. From as an individuals, and I think as a society. I mean that is the purpose, but that doesn't mean that that's a construct that's permanent or fixed. The world wasn't always this way, and the world will not always be this way. What I see is that the more oppressive the world becomes, the more people are at a point where they're become open to something new. And I think this is where our conversations might be actually of help to people who've gotten to that point. And my sense is that as the established order becomes more threatened, the established order is going to be more forceful in its oppression, which actually will serve the purpose of bringing more people out of an allegiance to the present order and a looking to create something new.
Yeah.
And so my sense is that the progress that I've made as an individual and that you're making as an individual and whichever viewers are making as an individual are going to be foundational for the creation of an order that actually is aligned with the truth of our full human development. So, and I think this ultimately is the goal. Now, I understand it's a long-term goal that's going to take many generations for it to happen, but for me, I see this point, like my life or what's left of my life, is that to the extent the rest of my life is constructive, it's constructive in helping to raise the consciousness of people to the point where together more and more of us can work on creating the conceptual frameworks for new systems or institutional systems that actually are the organizational foundation for society. I know I'm working right now on the development of the conceptual framework for an entirely new educational system that would, shall we say, replace the system, not reform the system. The system is dead. It's just leave it alone. Okay, there's nothing to resuscitate.
Yeah.
But to create a system that actually does meet the needs of humanity allows for the growth of the individual and encourages the growth of society. And that's really what we're working on. And my sense is this kind of work, it's already going on around the world, but that kind of work is only going to accelerate generation by generation. So I don't see the present oppression as threatening my progress or our progress. I see it as actually accelerating this progress.
I would agree. Disintegration.
I mean, how many people were at that event?
We had about 400 people.
About 400 people, and how long did you publicize that for?
2.5 weeks.
That's it. I mean, it was amazing to me.
Yeah.
And I was there. It was amazing to me to see the number of people who came, and I know it was more than was anticipated. And more than that, I was amazed to see the kind of, shall we say, positive energy that was within the room. Meaning, it wasn't just the energy where I want to learn something. It was the energy where I want to take part in
Creative
this change.
energy. Creative energy.
Right. I want to take part in this change. How can I contribute? And this is a real paradigm shift.
Yeah.
In the way people are beginning to see this. And this was just basically, most of these people were from one community.
Yeah.
You know, so I was very encouraged to see that there were that many people that were concerned enough to begin to be open to new ideas, to want more about those new ideas, and then to really better understand how they could take action in their own lives that will help bring sort of the creation of new systems about.
Yeah, they're interested in learning even how to work together with one another that share like-minded principles like this. And even in that journey, there are relationships that are difficult and conversations that are difficult to have, but the fear of having a difficult conversation does, again, what you had suggested the other night. If you're afraid to engage in conversation, you're already paralyzed.
Exactly.
So you can't be an agent of transformation if you're paralyzed through fear about your authenticity being something that will be rejected.
Exactly, right.
You know.
And all I want to say, and I know this is our last episode here, but on a purely spiritual level, is I work as a member of the Baha'i Faith, is I work on two levels. One level is I work with individuals and groups of individuals who literally want to raise their individual capacity to actually be of value in society. And on another level is I'm working, like just as I just referred to, is I'm working on projects which actually are meant to create the frameworks for real institutional change, and not just say institutional change in my community, but institutional change around the world. It's a worldwide movement and a global process, and if viewers are interested in knowing more about how to advance individually or how to contribute to institutional change, is I'd be happy. I mean, to me, this is why we're doing this. So we create the foundation for relationships to develop that can advance the process of transforming the world toward unity.
Well, I think when you and I post our discussions, when we finally get around to that here, we will apply the links to the YouTube idea, and so people could
Right.
click on and learn more about engaging in the
Right,
capacities of change.
Right.
It's just so it feels in the process of not just hosting the event, but being a part of creation and being engaged in that is so much more fulfilling from a spiritual level and a personal level and a community level. You realize the love that is out there in this world. It exists. And it is beginning to bind or bring people together. And I meant to say that about you yourself. You could, in theory, coast for the rest of your days.
Sure.
Sure. You could
That's what I'm
coast.
supposed to do.
That's what the institution tells you you
So
should
I've been
be
told
doing.
my whole life I should be playing golf or traveling.
Yes.
Certainly doing a lot of drinking.
But you... yes, sure. Well, we're not afraid to share a cocktail either. But you love your fellow man enough, and in the right ways. You exist, and your life is one of compassion and genuine search for truth and how to help civilization, how to help culture go through this transformational change. So I want to make sure that you know that I
Well, that's very nice of you to
see
say.
that in in the choices you make. And a lot of your choices that you've made, and I think I share those with you, they require courage in the face of the current paradigm. It requires speaking at times with courage, and to not let that be confused, that I think a lot of people do, is being self-righteous or arrogant.
No.
Right.
It's nothing to do with that. I would say that, and I appreciate what you say. It's wonderful for you to say those things, and I appreciate all that. But I have to say two things. Number one is that no matter where I am in the process, I'm just in the process like everyone else, and everybody brings qualities of value to the table, and everyone has something to contribute, and that's really important to know.
Yeah.
But also, I will say this is to the extent that I have, shall we say, stepped out into the world, and I'm sending what is a message which might be countercultural or, shall we say, even antagonistic to established
Heretic,
power.
I think, is used in...
Maybe, call it what you will, but I think to the extent I'm able to take those actions, the reason why is because I do engage in the discipline of my own intellectual and spiritual development to the point where I've become, over the course of my life, clearer and clearer and clearer about my own identity. And the clearer I am about my own identity, the easier it is to go out into the world and try to align what I say and what I do with what is true.
It's the actions, as I see it, as a spiritually mature being. And you are actually engaging in the process of what I think some people might even rely on angels to do. Or they wait for a supernatural solution when we can be the supernatural. You, as a spiritual entity, can be part of that solution or part of the process at the very least. And that is an uplifting, empowering message to young people and to even adults, as you had said. Most of this enrichment of the heart starts at home. And having those spiritual conversations or the gifts that God has blessed you with as an individual and transferred those gifts to your children through conversation that's meaningful is the first process to engage in that. And
Right. But I think this applies to everyone. We all have the capacity for it. And I think that we also can cultivate those capacities at any point in our life. I mean, I will say that in the household I grew up in, there was no spirituality at all. My father was an atheist. So, and he thought religion was the enemy. So it's fascinating to know that in my own development, my own intellectual development, it led me to examine spiritual reality and see the value of that. But so I say that, so people know that regardless of what background you come from and regardless of wherever you are in the process, is that path is still open for you. And you have no idea the kind of transformative power that it has once you decide to step onto that path and take a step forward. And I have found that the more I have stepped forward on that path, the more I've seen the value in it, and the more committed I am to it. And I think that's how things are. As much as on an intellectual level, I felt in my heart that this is true, is the more I step on the path and my actions conform more and more with that truth, is I find that that in itself to be incredibly transformative on every level, including a spiritual level. And I think that's what most people will find if they simply will let go of their own will, shall we say, where life becomes less and less about what I want and more about what is true. And I think that in many ways encapsulates the transformation from living as a teenager to actually living as an adult.
Yep. I couldn't say it better myself.
Think about that. So anyway, I really do appreciate our conversations.
Oh, yeah.
It's wonderful to be here. I don't know who's going to end up seeing this, but I'd love to get some feedback from whoever does see these to find out what kinds of questions it raises and what kinds of conversations that can grow out of all this.
It can generate.
Right. Okay.
Well, and again,
thank you very much.
You're
Matt.
welcome, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. We'll see you next time.
Take care.